Okay, so if you were with me in my first two videos, you saw me do the circular cast on, and then you saw me do the make one increase rows. So I've knitted one row of 28 stitches, which is row 6. And this video, I'm just gonna chat with you as I knit the next 7 rows. And then I'll start with row 14, the last row of straight knitting before I do the decreases. So if you're comfortable with double pointed needles, you can totally skip this video. I'm just going to be chatting about all kinds of stuff. Knitting, the power of small wins, and the fun that you can have when you learn to design and, make things. Okay, so just to recap, I have 8 stitches on the first 2 needles, 6 stitches on my last 2 needles, and I need to do, in this video, 7 more rows of 28, so I've got 28 stitches total. And I'm using 5 double pointed needles. These are size 3 and they're 5 inches long. Sometimes they're called sock needles. So all I'm going to do is knit from one needle off the back, and then I'm going to take the empty needle and start knitting off the next needle. So I always have one needle that I'm knitting onto. Okay, so I've got 4 needles. This now becomes my free needle, and I just need to organize my needles a bit, starting on my next. I do like to double check that I'm got the right number of stitches, especially if you're starting to knit. Sometimes you'll do something funky and you'll lose a stitch. Like sewing, knitters, successful knitters learn to unknit, which is sometimes called tinking. So learning the basic mistakes that you can make is one of the things that you need to learn when you start knitting. Figure out what mistakes do you make, how can you recognize them earlier so that you can fix them sooner. And also with double pointed needles, sometimes if your tension is a little bit loose, you can find a needle will slip out. If that happens, don't panic, because there are easy fixes. Typically, you're going to have time to get that stitch before it pulls out. It is a good idea to have a crochet hook on hand, because you can fix some dropped stitches and put them back on your needle with the help of a crochet hook. There are some wonderful knitting DVDs that show you how to fix common knitting mistakes. And I'm sure there's lots of YouTube videos too. So if something happens, just Google it, figure out what went wrong. Okay, so gosh, that's already one row. So that was row 7. So I'm going to put a check, row 7. There are stitch counters you can buy that you can just click a little button. It didn't really work for me. I love to write. Okay, so having a little piece of paper, sometimes it's just a notebook, and I'll write the row number down, and I'll have a shorthand notation for what part of the pattern it should be. If I'm, sometimes you'll have different purl rows or knit rows or slip stitch pattern. Just some memory jogger to help keep me track of where I am in the knit stitch pattern. This is just a basic knit stitch. I'm not doing anything fancy other than the increases and decreases. But I find that the checklist keeps me organized. And sometimes I just do it on a little post-it note. So I'll just write a row number down and put a check mark next to it. You don't need a fancy table like I've provided. But since I was converting the pattern from my handwritten shorthand to a typed version, I just figured I'd take the extra time just to put a handy little table off to the left. Let's check. So this was my first row of 6. I'm on my last row of 6. Once you learn how to cast on, how to increase, how to decrease, and there's one other trick you need. Whoops, I didn't get that clean. Try not to split your yarn when you make a stitch. For most patterns, not this one, the instructions will tell you to make a gauge swatch. So the gauge of your knitting will tell you how many rows you need to knit 1 inch and how many stitches equal an inch. So once you have that relationship, you can make a pattern piece any size you want. You just have to do the math. Okay, so I've done row 8. Let's put a check on row 8. One of the first DVDs that I watched when I was taking up knitting was by Laura Jean, and she made a dog sweater. She just measured her dog, and she got her knitting gauge, and she just came up with a pattern on the fly, and that hooked me on knitting. Because man, if you can make your own pattern, if you've got a yarn you like, you can get stitch dictionaries out of the library. Vogue has several. If you find a stitch pattern that you like, which patterns being combinations of knit and purl stitches to get a different texture to your knitting, sometimes also using different color. Cables are just knitting stitches out of sequence to get a cable. Man, you can come up with so many cool fabrics, and you can make them to any size you want. And that's one of the things I loved about sewing too, is once you learn how the basic pieces come together, you know, a bodice front, a sleeve, bodice back, a collar, you start off with very small things like baby clothes or doll clothes. Learn the basics, and before you know it, you can make anything you like. You can make car organizers, totes, your own clothing, dog clothing, costumes for Halloween, organizers to hold your knitting. Like I'm actually knitting on something I call my knit worker, which is just a knit fabric, and I've got some pockets that I made to hold my tools handy. You can't quite see it here, but I've got here pockets where I can slide my scissors in. I store a crochet hook here. I can slip my double pointed needles in here or in here. I've got a little zipper pocket where I store my tapestry, my yarn needles, stitch holders. So those keep them organized and right handy where I need them. And then I did a zipper around the outside so I can zip it all up and keep my knitting and my yarn organized together. And then I don't lose it, so I can take it in the car. This provides a nice platform for knitting if I'm traveling in a car, if I'm watching TV. It makes me really portable. Actually designed it so that I could get my steps in and could just kind of walk around the house. which I don't necessarily recommend, but it is super convenient for keeping your knitting organized and clean and protected. Okay, so that was row 9. When I started knitting, it all seemed so overwhelming. It's like, how much do you really have to learn? And you do want to learn to be able to read your knitting. And by that, I mean how the stitch sits properly on the needle, how to count stitches in rows. If you're not good at counting stitches in rows, you can keep track of it with a table like I do. But if you can tell a purl, so if I flip this over, that's what a purl stitch looks like. This is what a knit fabric looks like. Garter stitch is where you knit every row, and so you alternate. The fabric looks like an alternate of knit and purl rows. Sorry, I just split my yarn there. I tend to have tight tension knitting, which is great for these little yarn balls, gives it a really nice tight look. It gets a little bit more harder to do the decreases. I'm going to probably make a mistake here in a second on this last needle to kind of show you how to fix a couple common problems. So let's say I lost this stitch, okay? The stitch is still there. So I can either take a crochet hook through the loop and put it back on the needle. So yay, no problem. Or if it had fallen off and had come, let's say this got untucked, this is a common fix. You stick your crochet hook through the loop, pull that through, and then you can put it back on the needle. So see, good as new. So that's what I mean by there are common knitting mistakes that people make, especially when they're beginning, that can happen anytime. And that's a simple way to fix a dropped stitch. The thing that happens to me occasionally with knitting on double pointed needles is what happens if the whole needle comes out. And again, don't panic because your loops are still there. All you need to do is put the needle back in. So one of my early projects, so when I started sewing, I was making doll clothes, and that was great because you learn all the pattern pieces, but they're small size, so it doesn't take a lot of fabric, and you learn how to, how a shirt goes together, how a pair of pants goes together. You learn the basics. Knitting takes a lot more time than sewing because you're making the fabric. So if you learn by making toys like these balls, by the way, that was the end of a row. Mark that off. You see there, I just finished row 10. So if you learn to knit using toys or a baby sweater and you learn how to do the basic elements of a sweater, you can master your skills on small pieces that don't take as much time, don't take as much yarn. Build confidence, that's power of small wins. So you build your skill, you get better, you learn how to manage your knitting, and then you can take on more difficulty in the next project. And I'll tell you, one of the early things I found on the web, this super cute pattern of a knit turtle, which I made for one of my great nephews. Super cute. had to do a circular cast on, had to also knit legs, so I was learning about all kinds of stuff. But once you master double pointed needles, it's like, cool, I can do anything. It's such a confidence boost, and it gives you so much creativity and ways to look at, gee, how do I make that fabric? When I make sweaters with sleeves, I never do a single sleeve with the seam down the side, because knit seams are a lot bulkier. I would just rather knit them in the round. So I'll either use double pointed needles like I'm doing here, or you can use 2 circular needles. So you, similar to this, you knit onto one circular needle and off the other, okay, and then you're knitting onto the next one. So instead of 4 double pointed needles, I would be knitting on a set of 2 circular needles. So I am on my last needle of 6, I believe. So this is my second attempt at making a knitting video. And the first attempt was using my iPad. So this is row 11 from the side. And the iPad, the camera's way on one end. And, you know, it was too big for me to kind of look over it and see, you know, watch the action through the viewfinder. So most of the action was off to one end. I have this new cool toy that has an iPhone holder and a light all in one that will clamp onto a table. I've got it clamped onto something a little bit higher up to try to get a good angle at the knitting, but I'm hoping these videos will have a little bit more detail, be a little bit more useful than that first set. That's another needle of 8. I should be on, next is row 6. But my degrees are in mechanical engineering, aerospace, and materials engineering. So I've got bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD. But there was a time where I didn't think that I was gonna make it. And when I got that D in physics sophomore year, and I had to ask, do I have what it takes to stick it out in engineering? It wasn't the high school physics project that helped me stay the course. It was all the crazy projects that I dreamed up, problem solved, and figured out on my own as a kid in elementary school, and later in junior high and high school, that helped me stay the course. I knew I was creative. I knew how to solve problems. I just figured I had to learn a new medium. So there's a big difference between always going to like STEM club and experiments and just having hobbies that you create things, dream things up on your own, and you fail and you figure out, oh, that didn't work, or maybe it was okay, but I didn't like this. You learn principles of continuous improvement just by doing. You learn, gee, my workstation, my workspace, it'd be nice if I had my tools organized and handy, or I need my scissors close at hand, or if it's sewing, like new needles or change impressor feet. You figure out all that stuff And it relates to engineering, it relates to project management. You learn how long it takes for you to complete a pattern. And you learn what worked for you and what you do differently next time. And those are problem-solving skills that are hard to teach in school because it means you really need to go off-road. You really need to take the initiative yourself. But although they're the hardest skills to teach, they're the most transferable across disciplines. And engineering and STEM, a lot about problem solving. Coming up, defining a goal, figuring out what you need to complete it, and going off and solving it and checking your results. So that's why I am so big on making and designing things, because I think that's something that's fun. If it's your own hobby, start with your own hobbies. Learn creative problem-solving skills in design. And no matter what field you go into, it's going to help you. It's going to help you build confidence and know that you can get through tough challenges and come up with creative solutions. Okay, so I have just completed row 13. That's where I'm going to pause this video. Then I'm going to start the next one, knit my final row, and then do the decrease rows. See you in the next video.